Do you want me to do my clap thing?
Go.
We good?
This is the Luca Health Podcast, the show that goes beyond sport to understand the people behind the performances.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Nick Greenhalgh, co-founder and CEO of concussion management startup Luca Health. And today I'm delighted to welcome two good friends, Professor Bill Ribbans and Sam Peters. Bill's a leading orthopedic surgeon and sports medicine expert with over 30 years of experience at the top of elite sport. From the English National Ballet to pro cricket, rugby and football teams, he's been the go-to doc for some of the UK's top athletes. He's published over 150 scientific papers and is currently pioneering research in injury prevention, sports ethics and musculoskeletal genetics. I'm also absolutely delighted to say that Bill's recently joined Luca as our Chief Medical Officer. Sam's a former rugby correspondent for the Mail on Sunday and Sunday Times, and known for his fearless and balanced reporting on concussion in sport. In 2013, he launched what's been called the most influential sports campaign in newspaper history, pushing the issue of brain injury into the spotlight. In 2023, he published Concussed, Sport's Uncomfortable Truth, and founded Concussed Media to keep driving awareness and education forward. He's one of the leading voices in the conversation around athlete safety, and we're delighted to work with him as an advisor. Excited to take stock on all things concussion and athlete welfare, chart the evolution of the issue through to the present day and beyond. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Thank you.
How are you both?
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, very well, thanks. Hey.
Very cool. Very cool. Honestly, it's about 32 degrees in here.
I mean, we've had...
Yes. We're good.
Heat rises and we're on a mezzanine.
Yes.
A mezzanine floor. But no,
It's a lovely spot.
This is a bit of a long time in the making, really. Our relationship goes back,
Definitely. When did we first meet? 18 months ago?
I think, around about that time. And it's been very helpful for us ever since, really.
Well, I think it's great what you guys are doing. And, I think one of the most exciting things for guys like Bill and myself who've been looking at this for a long time, I think, is that there now seems to be a real drive towards trying to find some solutions, which is ultimately what we all want. And I love what Luca Health are doing. I love the fact that you're integrating technology and the latest smartphone technology into taking the subjectivity out of the decision making when it comes to return to play and helping athletes look after themselves better.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bill, we go back slightly further than 18 months. You operated on me when I was a 14-year-old.
I think that was the case, yeah, and I think it probably goes back before that, doesn't it, Nick, when you were at junior school?
Yeah, it does.
But, we've had a very long and lovely relationship with you and all of your family.
Yeah, absolutely.
What was the 14-year-old operation? That's young to be going under
It was your patella.
Patella. It was osteochondritis
Yeah, you
dissecans.
just dropped a loose body out of your kneecap.
Wow.
Yeah.
Rugby related or completely unrelated to rugby?
Long jump related.
Okay.
It was sports day my first year at Uppingham and just took off and cracked. I was like, that's not good.
So you got used to life under the knife from an early stage.
Exactly, yeah. But I don't call Bill Butcher Bill. I say it for him. You do a good job of it.
Why does all doctors get nicknames, don't they?
Yeah, no, I remember I was
Suits you.
Yeah, that was funny, really, because I was called various things at Northampton Saints. I mean, you say Butcher Bill was the natural one, but equally on the other end, they used to accuse me of not operating on them enough. And I said, I'm delighted to have that reputation rather than that of Butcher Bill.
It's definitely a rarity, isn't it, for a surgeon to be accused of not
operating,
do surgery.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. I thought we could just set the scene by way of understanding, your respective careers a little bit. And we're sat here, 2025 and concussion and athlete welfare very much front of mind, obviously for us based on what we do, but also for, a lot of parents, grassroots players, and of course, professionals out there as well. And I reflect, having had my career a long time ago, and concussion just wasn't on the radar really at all. We were talking earlier, Sam, about what we were doing back then from a baseline standpoint, but obviously awareness was nowhere near where it is today, and players were still being sort of congratulated for soldiering on, as it were, and times have changed significantly in the intervening 15 years or so. So I just thought, by way of setting the scene and understanding how this issue has evolved, both in the media but also within elite sport itself, would love to hear a little bit about your campaign in the national papers, which obviously led you to writing what is a tremendous book, by the way. I think if anybody is interested in understanding this in more detail than you're going to get in the next 45 minutes, I would highly, highly recommend checking Sam's work out. It's a page turner as well. I think people think of Concussion and think, oh, it's going to be a bit dry, but actually it's anything but that. So, why don't you talk about your time pushing this into the mainstream consciousness?
Well, thanks, Nick. Thanks for the kind words. I mean, I would also say Bill's book's a terrific book, and it was a very much part of my research for Concussed. Was reading Bill's book and others, who were prepared to talk very honestly about the challenges faced when it comes to looking after young people playing sport. I always came at this from absolutely a loving perspective of loving sport. I grew up living and breathing sport. I played a lot of sport growing up. I think I beat you to surgery. I had my first surgery aged 12 when I broke my finger playing cricket and stuck it at a right angle play for my dad's old Madonians, Chiswick Grammar School old boys cricket, and then ended up actually more seriously having 3 reconstructions on my shoulder at university, which led me into sports journalism, because I wasn't going to make it in any way, shape or form, because my body wouldn't let me. So, really quickly after becoming a journalist in the early 2000s, when rugby had just gone professional, it was just really obvious to me that the game was changing radically. There was a lot of stuff going on which we were told was best practice, which we were told was, science in action, but it was just clearly being made up on the hoof, and players were getting badly hurt and were just getting spat out the other side. And I was really uncomfortable with it. I grew up whenever I played, I wanted to look after my teammates. I always thought rugby was about looking after each other as well as much as it was about smashing the opposition. And I didn't really, I felt very uncomfortable with the disconnect, which was how the game was being promoted as a sport that was, player welfare is our number one priority, rugby family, we look after everyone. And then it was just really obvious that once players were no longer of any use, they were just off you go next on the conveyor belt. And I didn't like it. I didn't like it. And concussion to me was an obvious problem. It was, as the injuries got more severe, the head injuries were getting more frequent. The collisions were getting more frequent. The game was just far more confrontational and physical. And I just challenged the position of the governing bodies, I suppose, which they were telling us the game was safer than it had ever been. They were telling us that the boys were getting, and girls latterly were getting the best medical provision. That's not what I was hearing from within the dressing room. It wasn't what I was seeing with my own eyes. And I guess by 2013, loads of things had come together around that time that gave me, and by that time, my position as rugby correspondent at the Mail on Sunday, it was just like, we've got to move here, we've got to do something. And that was really the kind of genesis of the campaign.
Were there any instances, I think, having read your book, Lewis Moody, 2007 World Cup?
Yeah.
Was it?
Yeah, Tonga 07, Lewis played on twice, having been knocked unconscious. So not just, a bit woozy, not just, a bit unsteady. Absolutely no doubt. Under any rule of any sport, pretty much, that was end of game, carried on playing. I mean, it sounds weird, but in a way that was a little bit of a relief to me that sort of incident happened in a World Cup game, because I was seeing that happen week in, week out at Premiership level, and that was normal. And then that actually got very little attention in 2007. It's now used as a reference point, but it wasn't. It was still another 4 or 5 years. The George Smith 2013, which I opened the book. I covered that game live,
The last time the Lions were in Australia.
Yeah, exactly. So gosh, yeah, we were already 12 years ago. That's flown by. But that was pretty much, when I started writing about concussion, because that was when the pitch side concussion assessment came in.
Yeah.
And it was like, right, we can measure this now. Are they actually living by what they're saying? And, you can start to, sit the data next to the actual action and what was really happening. And yeah, that when that happened in front of millions of people, and the Australians were still confident enough to put him back on the field when anybody could see he had a brain injury, I was like, yeah, come on.
Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah.
And so, Bill, from your perspective, was it until sort of 2013, was the science just not there? Why there seemed to be an ambivalence at best towards this issue? Or was it just we didn't fully understand? Because it's certainly in the noughties, at the end of the noughties, and getting into the period that Sam's talking about in 2013, there wasn't a huge amount of scrutiny placed on this. And I don't know whether it was naivety or ignorance from the powers that be, or whether it was just science. We didn't actually know enough about head injuries and returning players.
I think it's unfair to say that there wasn't any awareness within sport in general. If we go back 100 years coming up, we've been aware of the adverse effects of repeated head brain injury in boxing, dementia, pugilistica. We were aware globally of what was happening in America. And I think one of the sadnesses for me is that sports like rugby union that are now in the spotlight have seemed to be unwilling to learn the lessons. They've wanted to start again and re-examine their sport from almost point zero, instead of getting on the research and clinical train that's already left the station and knows a lot of what's already there. So that's been a disappointment. It was interesting, really, kind of hearing Sam talk about how he got there, because I think although we've had very different careers, we've had very similar influences of how we've got to this stage. I think grew up presumably in sports mad families like you did, Nick. Probably Sam and I dreamt of perhaps getting to where you did, Nick. Kind of either through injury or just that lack of something, didn't quite make it, but wanted to make an impact within sport. My father was a sports journalist, my sister's a journalist. It was my intention to be a sports journalist. And it was only really right at the end of my school education that I made a late decision to
see sense
to go to medicine. With A levels in history, geography, and economics. It wasn't an obvious medical career pathway, but my intention had always been to go into medicine and somehow find my way back into sport. And that kind of brings me around also to your question, because it was only in the 2000s that a real interest in sports medicine as a science and as a clinical specialty came about in this country. We were far behind South Africa and Australia. And in fact, for many years, we in this country depended on bringing sports medicine experts over from those countries and following their research. So when I qualified in 1980 as a doctor, that was 25 years before sports medicine was recognised as a career. And so it was really trying to in terms of assessing players and in general welfare, whatever, there just wasn't the vehicle. And certainly many of my bosses in the 80s regarded sports injuries as self-inflicted injuries that went to the back of a long NHS waiting.
You write about that in your book, don't you?
Yeah.
There's very little sympathy for those that picked up injuries playing for Richmond or whatever.
Absolutely, and because rugby union was an amateur game anyway, wasn't it? So, yes, and I suppose also kind of for me, having actually, I started working in the field of sports medicine in 1981, the year after I qualified. And it was only really in the last 5 or 10 years that I felt able to speak up about the concerns that I had. And I think it sounds kind of rather cowardly, but I feel sorry for my colleagues now in their late 30s, 40s, as medics trying to make a career in the world of elite sport, because they're afraid to speak up. Because unlike within the NHS or something like that, your career can be shaped by how you interact with a chief exec, how you interact with a football manager or whatever. And those people tend to be not very sympathetic.
We've got completely different agendas.
Yeah. And as you know, I repeatedly go back to that kind of Venn diagram of performance and welfare. And within the performance sphere is clearly the coaching staff, the sports psychologists, the strength and conditioning guys. And then in the welfare, there's got to be the medical staff, I regard really the physiotherapy staff, and the clinical psychologists. And it's when those two circles begin to overlap that you get into problems like British Cycling did with their team doctor and many other examples. And I just see these mistakes being repeated all the time of people in positions where they should know better, mixing those up and the welfare getting confused with performance.
Because it goes back to culture. If you're operating in an environment where, we were just talking about this more going on, potentially pretty hierarchical places, and people that know better are forced into making decisions they wouldn't otherwise make, right?
Well, it was always, or not always, but certainly became increasingly obvious to me when I started looking at this. I was fascinated by the Lance Armstrong kind of, the relationship between the team doctors and US Postal cycling, and I was fascinated by the role that doctors and medics and physios played in looking after the players whilst also serving a different master. It was clear to me, there was just so much overlap, and I always found it strange. I know when I wrote the book, the first draft, I put this in, and the publisher was like, "Is that really relevant?" But I kind of insisted to keep it in, because the idea that and you do still see it, and I do understand why, but you see doctors and physios like jumping up and down, cheering when their team scores a try, and it's sort of like, where does the line draw? Is the line draw around responsibility, duty of care to the athlete? Bill talks about welfare crossing over with performance, but to me, the duty of care for the doctors had to be to the players, and I was seeing so many instances where directors of rugby, because that's mainly what I was covering, although I saw it was less obvious in cricket, although there was some cases which I found where just basically pressure was applied to players to carry on when they clearly shouldn't have, by any measure of reasonable kind of clinical sort of assessment, and as soon as the coaches got into the doctors' ears or the physios, these guys, the coaches and directors of rugby were basically, as far as I was understanding it, and I think I was probably right in my interpretation, that they could play God with your career just like they could with the player's career. So incredibly powerful. And whilst I was sort of starting to look at it but didn't really know what to do with that interest, I guess Bloodgate happened, which was 2009. And it was just confirming to me that if you got a director of rugby or a boss of an organisation, the kind of, let's call them the alpha, which a lot of them are, who was essentially prepared to do anything to win, and use all manner of intimidatory tactics to achieve that, really bad things could happen and good people could be driven to act in, deeply questionable ways. And I guess it was Bloodgate for me that started to really go, okay, then I think the pressure that's being applied around concussion, my concerns around there could be more in this. And actually the doctors and the physios need to be empowered. They need to be given more autonomy.
Yeah, that's the problem. As you said, who is your primary duty of care to? People are employed by the sporting authority. And if you go back and you compare them to an occupational health unit working in Ford's factory or something like that, and what the relationship is. And really, it isn't any different. You're looking after the employees. And there should be your primary duty of care is to your patients. And then, as you know, I've been very vocal about things like confidentiality, what should and shouldn't be divulged. But there's a view that in all sports that sporting directors, managers should have full access to people's medical history, recent and long term, and actually people working, as you say, clinicians working in that realm need to be aware of their responsibilities and how would they behave outside of that sporting environment. And I think, the big change, Sam, really came when, with all sports, not just the traditional amateur sports like rugby union, but when the clinicians, the doctors, the physiotherapists, because did become paid.
Yeah.
Most of them throughout most of my career, it was entirely voluntary.
Voluntary, yeah.
You worked outside of the organisation. You were lucky enough to have a good career and a good salary.
But you were independent.
You were totally independent.
Yeah.
And as you know, working down at Northampton Saints for 20 years and having to pay for my season ticket to get in to work pitch side. But actually, I preferred that because I was totally independent.
Yeah.
And it did bring me into conflict with one or two people. But there was great people. I mean, when you go and work in various organisations, you soon get to know the good guys.
Yeah.
And the Ian McGeekins of this world, the Wayne Smiths of this world. Yeah. Perhaps because they're all backs. Yeah. Perhaps they had a little bit more understanding than, but
or they were school teachers originally.
Yeah.
I keep coming back to all the good guys when it comes to directors of rugby. They've all been teachers at some point because they've had to look after kids and look after their
well-being.
Their well-being. Yeah. I mean, I'm slightly joking, but I mean, I do think of people like Brian Ashton. I think of Wayne Smith was a teacher. Am I imagining that?
I can't remember. I don't know what Wayne's back.
Stuart Lancaster. All these guys who you go and speak to the players and go, are these guys interested in more than just winning tomorrow? Are they actually interested in looking after me? I know that's quite a big generalisation, but I think there is a little bit in that. There's smart people who realise that rugby is just part of life rather than life.
Yes.
Chris Boyd speaks brilliantly.
Yeah, okay.
On Dan Bigger's podcast.
Right. I haven't.
Sports business syndicate or something like that. Anyway, Chris Boyd was just saying that he brought a calmness to a professional rugby environment to work. He'd been a teacher and he'd worked outside of that as well before rugby turned professional, and sort of saw it for what it was and thought that actually looking after and developing human beings was much more important than actually the results on Saturday. And I think that's been lost in the last, to a certain extent.
I think it could be lost. I don't think it has been. I've still got quite a bit of faith left that there's enough good guys in there still to look after these guys. But what Bill just said really reminded me of something I heard on one of the other podcasts you've done recently with Russell Earnshaw, which I thought was brilliant, by the way. And what an amazing voice. How deep is his voice? But
gravelly.
Much more importantly, how much sense does he speak? Yeah. And that idea you just talked about, directors of rugby getting getting medical knowledge, personal knowledge. And I think Russell was talking about like how suffocating it could be as a professional when every bit of your life is monitored and controlled, and you're very vulnerable. You're really vulnerable. And as I think that was partly driving me was this realization that yes, these were 20-year-old tough guys, but they were still people. They were human beings who were very vulnerable to injury, very vulnerable to pressure, bullying in the wrong circumstances. Look what happened to Tom Williams at Harlequins. But, just one, so no voice. I'm highly critical in the book about the Rugby Players Association as it was when I was covering it. I think it's moved forward a long way now, although I still would love to see, and I still think as long as its funding comes largely from RFU and Premier Rugby, it's still deeply compromised. But my point is that players don't have anywhere to go. They don't have a voice. They are preyed upon, essentially. And I think that's where you need directors of rugby, people in charge of the organisation who genuinely care about their welfare as well as just...
And so I think for the players themselves, if they have a view that's not only the DORs, but also the physios, the doctors, who are the people that they should feel confident in confiding.
Yeah.
And if they don't feel that conversation may be private, because it may just feed back, then they can feel lost and isolated. And it's interesting because a couple of years ago, the Tanny Gray-Thompson report into safeguarding and welfare of sport, and for me, it's very sad because I don't think hardly anything has been implemented out of it. And she highlighted this problem of the clinical care of athletes and how she would like to see it divorced, from the performance side. I mean, practically, it's just really difficult.
Of course, yeah.
And probably if World Rugby commented on this, they'd say, well, for things like concussion, we've now got independent consultants, concussion consultants we might want to come back and talk about. But it is difficult because who's going to fund these people? The days of me and everybody else turning up and actually paying to get in and look after them are long gone. People want proper remuneration for being there and also taking the difficult decisions. And who's going to fund it and look after them if it's not going to be the clubs themselves? I mean, as you know, I've kind of highlighted my concerns that a number of decisions regarding player welfare, because of the overwhelming personality of the football manager, the DOR and rugby union, are actually directed by these people and also agents. And we've seen time in Premier League football, yet another European manager comes in, and not only do they come in and also bring in all their coaching staff, but they bring all their medical staff and their physios in. And these are people who, A, don't know the squad they're inheriting. They don't know anything about the way that British medicine works. And that manager is often sacked on average, 12, 15 months. They'll depart and the next lot come in. And where is the continuity of care of looking after these people?
It's interesting. It's also interesting seeing, Premier League football managers giving press conferences and more often than not being asked about injury matters. And, you hope that they're sort of just passing on the message that's been given to them by the head of medicine. But, sometimes there's perhaps some messaging going on.
Yeah.
It sounds like there has to be...
Well, there's a couple of things about that, Nick. It is that's usually the Friday morning press conference, isn't it? One is they are supposed to have the players' permission for release of that. And so the doctor and the physio are in trouble if they've not sorted. And secondly, as we know, often the manager will use that information for tactical gain, which is, I think, awful. Really.
I remember there's a lovely guy called Bob Cass, who was a Mail on Sunday's chief football writer, and lovely man, brilliant reporter, always theory was he knew Alex Ferguson better than anyone else, and he didn't often break stories about Man United, it was fair to say, but you'd often find stories about others and just popping up here and there. And he was kind of forgiven everything because the theory was that Fergie would ultimately tell him when he was going to retire. So as long as he got Fergie's retirement story, everything was all right, because that was going to be such a big story. I remember one day reading back, and I'd been in the office and this story dropped, and it was like Bob Cass exclusive, sources inside Man United, and Man United were going to play Everton the next day. Yeah. And Wayne Rooney was, get this right, Man United were playing Everton and Rooney was playing for Man United.
Yeah.
But obviously going back to play Everton, massive game, it was all about Rooney. And the back page story was Rooney to miss Everton game the next day, or today, as in Sunday. And, it was from Bob Cass, so everyone assumed that as it was, it come from Fergie. And of course, it was a load of rubbish. But if Fergie just told him he's not going to play, he's injured, and to get the message to Everton to make them think, oh, Rooney's not playing, Bob Cass must know because it's come from Fergie. And of course, he started, and he played, and I think he scored and whatever, but totally took Everton by surprise. But he just used that, to play Bob basically, and then bless him, he didn't get Fergie's retirement story in either. But yeah, it's that's definitely that's how cynical. Bosses can be, and they know they can play the media, essentially.
I think in an ideal world, to Bill's point, there would be a decoupling, right, between performance and welfare, which is obviously now very, very hard given the high-performance nature of elite sport. Mm. Given that is sort of the world we live in now, like, what's the solution? Just greater checks and balances so that you can't your DOR or your Premier League manager, applying pressure. I don't know what that looks like. My own experience of elite sport is at the Saints, and it seemed to be that the business side of the club and the rugby playing side of the club were basically two different businesses, and it seemed to me that there wasn't, the rugby ruled the roost rather than the people who were employing the coaches. I don't know whether there's been much of an evolution in terms of governance within club sports.
Very little. I often make a point of when I'm talking to colleagues and say, do you know who you report to? This is talking about the sports doctors within organisations. And usually it's not clear who it is. And it's often therefore it's often de facto the manager or the coach. And as you know, it's the managing coach that sack people. When I'm giving a lecture to young doctors thinking about careers in sports, I put a slide up with five doctors' faces on and say, do you know what these 5 doctors have in common?
Yes.
And you know what I'm going to say? They're all sacked by managers or coaches. And that comes as quite shocking to young doctors who've grown up in an NHS culture where as long as you do a good job.
Sorry, Bill.
So I've always tried, not always succeeded, where I'm working with a sporting organisation, to want to make it clear where my line of reporting is, and that has got to bypass the performance side, and it's got to go to the chief exec.
Yeah.
And sometimes the chief execs don't quite understand what the implications of that are. But you can't have managers who just on a whim decide they're going to get rid of physios and doctors because they don't like them. And, I've had one poor physiotherapist, a very, very capable physiotherapist who one manager who remained nameless, still active, just carpeted every week. The players were either coming back too early at the manager's insistence and getting re-injured, or they were rehabbing too slowly for the manager's liking and just threatening to sack the physiotherapist every week. And
with that knowledge, though, Bill, and that is, what you say is, sadly, I'm sure, absolutely true. But then, isn't that a major barrier to entry for really highly aspirational young medical people? Like, why would you choose to come into that environment?
Absolutely, and I think for both physiotherapists and doctors who are sports minded, that they look at it and think, well, that's a career I'd like to be involved in, as I did. But then the reality hits when you get in there and you realise the pressures you're under, the personalities that you've got to deal with very, very little help from the overarching employer.
And I mean, and I guess I'd just like, I think this is still on topic, but why I was so just, I guess, flawed, flabbergasted, whatever the words, but when England appointed Eddie Jones as the head coach of England, like the RFU they chose to employ him. They knew what they were getting, right? They knew they were getting this guy who was, everyone in rugby knew that Eddie Jones, a 2-year coach, he will flog the guys to within an inch of their life, use basically any means within his means to push them all the time, and all his staff every minute of every single day. You never relaxed. You never knew where you stood. You never, and someone obviously very well, Bill, but Dylan Hartley in his book described it like being in a Victorian sort of, like school children just
in the workhouse.
Terrifying, like just a genuinely horrible place to go to work.
Weren't you?
I mean, you'd have them by your door. I mean, you'd see the backroom staff I remember after they got done by Conor O'Shea's Italy team at Twickenham with the no ruck thing. And, Eddie was, beyond angry in the press conference afterwards. But then 3 days later at Pennyhill Park, I turned up and I looked at these coaches and the backroom staff looked ill, like all of them, genuinely ill. And, that wasn't just the backroom staff he was exerting that sort of strain on. The players, the RFU's own data shows that the injury statistics spikes across the whole of English rugby when Eddie Jones was in charge of the England team. Where does the Danny Care's gone on the record, talked about it. Everyone knows how bad it was. Why has the RFU employed him?
Yeah.
What's the job of the RFU? If you play devil's advocate,
Well,
commercial performance,
to make rugby sustainable in this country. To
Number one priority, yeah.
look at that and go, the England coach is allowed to get away with that. Why would you let your kids play rugby? Why would you send your kids into that environment knowing that that's the pinnacle?
Well, I mean, the important thing is that nobody should be any doubt that many of these people appointed into these high performance jobs are extreme egotists.
Extreme
Egotists.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they are
Yes.
there for what they get out of it.
Yeah.
If somebody wins a World Cup, somebody wins a European Championship, that's on their palmares as we're in the Tour de France 3 weeks. And they will ride roughshod over every athlete and every support staff. And we know, just looking objectively at the injury rates during the Eddie Jones era, during training in England camps, it just went through the roof.
Yeah, it was
Now,
crazy.
I'm sure what he would say was that they've got to be battle hardened. But he was quite... It seemed that there was a view that you knew they were going to sacrifice people on the way, for the foot soldiers would be walking over their own troops.
Collateral damage,
to get there.
Yeah.
And if we'd have won a World Cup, you might have said, well, it was worth it.
I'm not sure it would have done, and I know what you're saying, but I still think, even if England had won the World Cup, I think that, Clive Woodward said in 2003 it was the worst thing that could have happened at that point in time for England, because he was trying to implement central contracts, player welfare initiatives, things to essentially enable him as the England boss to reduce the amount of the volume of games that they played. I think if Eddie Jones had won the World Cup in 2019, that would have been a disaster for English rugby, because that would have been a blueprint to go, that's how rugby should be played, that's how players should be managed, that's how players should be coached, that's how people should be treated. And Eddie Jones treated people appallingly, across the board, whether it was a journalists, who cares about them? But, you could just see it. You could see it, and it was horrible. Yeah, Sam Jones was the worst case of it all, but there were lots like that, and lots of people were damaged as a result of that.
I'm sure.
tenure.
I'm sure. Interesting stuff. Let's change gears slightly and talk about where we are today. I'm actually keen, Sam, for you to reflect maybe towards the end of the chat around or how you reflect on the 10-year campaign, really, and where we are today, and whether enough has changed above and beyond education and awareness. But for right now, I'm keen to talk about something that's relatively hot off the press, and that being World Rugby's 6-point improving.
They like a 6-point plan, don't they? They like a Should we remind us what they are?
It seems fairly high level. Well, there's 6 different areas, and they go into more granular detail. The first being care for players and former players. Second being game delivery led by evidence. The third being evolution of the game through consultation, regulation and monitoring. The fourth being women-specific interventions. And education and compliance support. And the last one being fostering a culture of welfare within the game. Sam, I know you've been... We've actually commented on the release on the Luca website.
Okay.
Luca.health for those that are interested. And Bill's comments on there. But Sam, I thought I'd just throw this at you.
I don't know what any of that means.
Yeah.
If any of it said we are going to insist that players play fewer than 25 games of rugby a season, professional rugby a season, and if it said we're going to ensure that contact training was basically made illegal during the season, and we are going to make sure that athletes get proper provision for not being exposed to coaches on a daily, hourly, minute by minute, 24 hours a day, and we're going to police this, then fair enough. I just don't really know what that means, any of it.
I completely agree. When I first saw it, I thought that was just it, the 6 points. I was like, that is someone's first stab at ideating what we should do here.
Yeah.
You've given that to a couple of interns. Shout out to the Luca intern, who come up with that.
They're watching the cricket.
He's watching the cricket. There's no further work done on it. But to be fair, they do go into slightly more granular detail. But
yeah, okay, fair enough. But I think it's even that is pretty loose, though, isn't it?
It is.
I'm
It's aspirational rather than.
Well, it's what I stated just in that brief thing on the Luca website. They're kind of mission statements, aren't they? We've got to know what the detail is. From my medical point of view, kind of, they talk about kind of evidence, don't they? Kind of, well, we know that they make a big play on the amount of research, but we need it to be independent research, and that means that ideally, what I'd like to see is World Rugby putting money into an independent body who decide themselves where that research is, that they ask for people to come forward with ideas, and it's completely at arm's length from World Rugby.
Yeah.
I think, they're all very laudable aims, aren't they?
Yeah.
But how are they going to audit it? When is it going to be measured? Are they actually going to come back in 3 years' time, 2 years' time, and say, well, we've achieved this and that? Are they going to be that transparent?
And the independent concussion consultants, it sounds like you might have a view on those. Have you looked at them in any more detail? I don't know who the consultants are and how, to what extent they're trained to do that, or how that works, because that's them making sure that the protocol is actually followed. So this isn't like head injury assessments, is it? It's when you're on a protocol, they're making sure that they're not being returned faster than is in the best interest of the individual.
Well, you've got two aspects of this. You've got the match day independent concussion consultant, and then you've got taking players during their RTP protocol to an independent assessor. I've found with my discussions with World Rugby, going back over the last 4 years, is that they often try and shut down the debate by saying we've got world experts. You don't know what you're talking about. We've got world experts, and this is. I can only talk from personal experience. I can't say what's going on everywhere, but then I find that the independent match day consultant is a junior doctor who's doing some research and wants to earn some money on a Saturday afternoon. Now, I'm not saying that happens everywhere, but I know of examples of that. So for them to tell me that, well, this is a world expert kind of sitting at Leicester or Sale on a Friday night is not quite so, because essentially they can't afford whoever is a world expert, because if you want a very senior neurologist, neurosurgeon sitting at a game at a weekend, they want an awful lot of money to be there. They're not going to pay it.
And I think that's exactly where rugby got itself into such a hole really early on in professionalism, where the truth was it was still evolving. It was still basically amateur with a few professional rugby league sort of mass infiltration into rugby union. If that infiltration sounds like a bad influence, which not entirely at all. Obviously, rugby league coaches have done some incredible things and brought union up to speed on so many levels. But essentially, what am I trying to say? I think. Where have I gone with this? But ultimately, rugby league has had an influence across the board of union. But what was your point, Bill? Because I've just gone off on a total tangent. But
in terms of the consultants and saying we've got world class.
Yes, sorry. So exactly that. So essentially, union was basically saying we've got all the best medical provision. We are at the cutting edge of world sport, when it just wasn't. It was way, way behind. So the problem was they set that bar in terms of the narrative when the reality was nowhere near it, and that's where the disconnect was. And I think in many ways they're still trying to catch up. But for the reasons Bill articulated so well, it's actually really challenging to attract the best people into that environment. And the truth is, I think, sadly, although there are some very, very good doctors in rugby as there are in professional sport, I think to claim that the very best are in those environments is not necessary.
I think we might suffer in this country from having so many sports and a relatively populous country. Mm-hmm. When I think back at looking at where I think really successful nations are, I think of Australia with the Australian Institute of Sport. Norway, which I visited their centre, is amazing because Norway are the most successful sporting nation on this planet. They had a population by far. But because they're a small population, they've been able to concentrate their resources and anybody in any sport who's any good finishes up in the Oslo centre where they're really concentrated with fantastic clinicians, fantastic research. And there's just too many historic vested interests, and trying to get football, cricket, rugby, track and field to come together and share resources. We just seem to have gone too far down the line to bring them all back into line and share knowledge.
It makes sense. Norway, that makes sense because predominantly Olympic sports and Winter Olympic sports, and you can understand how funding would work there. I guess in this country, rugby and football wouldn't necessarily fit in. I was just thinking about why has Australia got it right? And I think Australian Institute of Sport, was there a lot of funding put into that ahead of the 2000 Olympics?
You also don't. You've got a cleaner pyramid, don't you? It's not. You don't have that tension between the clubs and the. You've got club, state, national team. Yeah. It's a more obvious pyramid of progression. But I think the reason. I think also it is important while we're clearly articulating some of the problems that rugby has progressed. There's been. Asked me about the 2013 Mail on Sunday campaign that we launched back then around concussion. Like, people weren't talking about concussion being a problem really before then. It certainly wasn't public conversation. And I think, thank goodness, it is a public conversation now, because at least that enables some sort of accountability or forces some sort of accountability. You asked about media attitudes towards concussion in sport. Yes, the focus is heavily on rugby because there are a lot of concussions in rugby, and the change in the game in the 30 years or so since it's gone professional has radically increased the number of concussions. That's not just because people are more aware of them, by the way. It's just because there are more. Yeah. And I think one of the things that frustrates me about the World Rugby and RFU and governing bodies talking about evidence-based, only making decisions based on evidence, is that the evidence, their own evidence, tells us that professional rugby today is as dangerous in terms of the risk of suffering a severe injury a career-threatening injury or a risk of suffering a concussion, it's that those numbers are as high today as they've ever been.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that I've been questioning myself about, and comes back to the core of this book. Was really, it's 5 years now since it came out. Was where was sports medicine in 1980 and where was it in 2020? 40 years from really no care to almost smothered care, and yet we have more injuries and more high-profile problems than we've ever had before, and yet we're spending all this huge amounts of money supposedly on welfare, and yet the problems are getting worse. So I have to ask, am I the problem? Are the physios the problem? Are the relatively new profession of strength and conditioning the problem? Because we can put people back together when they would have had career-ending injuries 40 years ago, but that might have actually been better for their long-term health.
Yeah.
We make them bigger, stronger, faster. But you're not going to turn around and find a strength and conditioning coach, say, I think I'm making these boys too big and too fast and too strong.
That's their job.
Because that's Turkey's voting for Christmas.
Yeah. And Bill's it's so right. And the thing you can't make stronger or protect in any way, shape or form, really, when someone goes onto the field, is the brain. And if you're asked, here we are sitting in 30 odd degree heat in a greenhouse.
You're doing well.
I'm feeling very cool. But we're in July, well into July, and the Lions tour is, only just getting going. The Lions will finish playing in August, and 4th of August is the third test, I think. And don't tell me those Lions who finish from 4th of August are going to get a call from director of rugby at any Premiership club, apart from one or two of the very most enlightened ones, and go, don't worry, stand down for 2 months. You've put in a proper year-long plus shift here. It's the set, and I think what's bitterly frustrating for me and others who really care about the welfare of the players is this isn't a particularly different conversation to the one that was going on 10, 12, 15, 20 years ago. And sport as a whole, I think, is in serious state. Like, we've reached saturation point. The idea, back in the day when the All Blacks would just come over once every 10 years and it was something to look forward to. Like, we've saturated the market, and that's happened in cricket. It's happened in football. I turned on channel, was it 4 or 5 last night? And, there was PSG was playing someone in the World Cup.
World Cup.
Yeah.
Come on, just let it go. Just heads, like,
I completely agree.
Just leave it. Let everyone needs a break.
Bigger, faster, stronger. Yeah. He's out of the bottle.
Yeah.
So what's the one thing that you can control?
Yeah.
Well,
workload.
The environment.
Yeah. Exactly.
Matches, and actually how much enforced rest people are given.
Absolutely.
And my question to you before we move on, so I want to talk about schools a little bit and some of the really good stuff that's been done before that. We could literally talk all day. Would be around, okay, is there going to be an impact of this lawsuit within rugby, but hopefully within others? I don't want there to be more lawsuits in other sports, but one of the good things about the NFL having a suit brought against it is that potentially some of that hubris has been dropped, and then there's more humility there now, and they have made changes. Yeah. Training is completely regulated, so you can't have a Dean Richards type controlling that environment anymore, and there's like zero contact in NFL training.
And look at the NFL today, the product on the pitch compared to 12 years ago when that lawsuit happened. Is it any less obviously physical, fast, dynamic?
Just exciting.
Just as good a product.
60 game season. It's a scarcity.
Yeah.
It's basic.
And they really are. That is the most sophisticated sport, the most commercialised sport. It's the most sports science. It's the most mature sport, professional sport, and they genuinely understand how to look after athletes.
And it's what you're saying. I mean, for FIFA to have put in that program, and the obscene amounts of money that they basically bribed the clubs to go to. And I mean, the clubs have been out, the clubs that are still in, been out there for a month, when all these players should be resting.
Cool.
And we've had some horrible injuries, like the Bayern lads, a horrible broken ankle. But but we know from all the research that the players that play in summer World Cups, Euros, and now this World Cup, that they'll all be on the bench. They'll all be on the treatment bench come October, November, December. That is when the problems are going to happen, and the fans who support all these Premier League clubs are going to find so many of their really good players and all across Europe are going to be injured as a direct result. And FIFA Pro at least have tried to stand up and do and make these concerns known, but FIFA just don't want to listen.
Because they don't really care.
Within rugby, do we think the lawsuit will have an effect? Will there be a rowing back of that position that you said that they set out their stall far too aggressively, perhaps? You know, I understand while stuff is going back and forth between lawyers and potentially going to see it stay in court, it's difficult to change track too much from a policy standpoint.
Well, I like the comment you just made, actually, Nick, which is, lose some of the hubris. Just actually let's just step back from this a little bit. I'm not as fearful of the lawsuit as I think a lot of people in rugby are, because I've seen that the changes that can happen in a sport when the law gets involved, and it's so patently obvious to anyone who has a vague understanding of professional sport that if you keep flogging people into the ground, they're going to get damaged and broken, and it's going to be unsustainable. And I think rugby, everybody knows the players play too much at the top level. The top, elite players play far too much rugby, but there is no serious move to align the seasons, or it's not happened. It doesn't seem so. Something pretty seismic's got to happen. I think lots of talk about breakaway leagues, leagues that have far fewer matches and the players are properly looked after. Like if I was a player now, 22-year-old, and I know where I'd gravitate to if I was good enough and wanted. Then you go where you're going to be looked after and you could sustain your career.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether the case will come to court or not, or whether there will be a settlement. I think whatever the outcome, if it does go to court, Nick, I don't think World Rugby will welcome the discussion, even if they win the case, of the pros and cons, because the future of rugby is not going to be dictated by Sam or myself or yourself. It is going to be by schools, parents, and also
Totally agree.
Insurance companies.
Yeah.
We know in Australia, some of the insurance companies with not only rugby union but the ARL and league are beginning to get tougher and tougher on what they'll insure and what they won't insure, and that could have a big impact on the future of rugby union and other contact sports.
Interesting.
I completely agree that schools I think will dictate where rugby goes in the future, and that's actually why I'm really encouraged. Weirdly, although I might not have sounded it from the course of this podcast, but what I've definitely seen in the last couple of years since the book came out is a really significant move in schools sport. Head teachers really get it. They really understand where their duty of care lies. They really understand the benefits of playing rugby. Or playing sport generally. I think let's put rugby into it's not the only sport people play in schools, far from it. But the benefit of playing sport, all of us around this table and anyone who's invested in this conversation will love sport fundamentally. But I think everyone has a different attitude to risk and what's a tolerable risk, essentially. And I think schools understand, I think, the language we're probably talking around this table a little bit more than the language which is doesn't matter, never did me any harm, get on with it, don't be soft. It's just pub language, but it doesn't. It's nonsense. And let's just be much more grown up about this. How are we going to make this great game viable in 25, 30 years' time? Who are the people that are going to change that? Who historically have been the people that have affected change in how the game's played? And it's basically been schools and universities. And I think the same will probably happen again.
I think That's really important. And I think there needs to be a focus on who is responsible for different elements of the game. It's almost as though the elite game has kind of just gone away.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just so different from 30 years ago. The gap between good junior sides now and the elite game is just light years apart, aren't they? When they weren't 30 years ago. And to be honest, and this, we understand it, World Rugby's emphasis is on the elite game.
Yes.
Now that 6 point they've come out with last month, talks about the community game, but really they devolve it down to the individual unions. And even within the individual unions, we talk about the RFU. Should there be two different streams between looking after the professional game and looking after the community game? And I think all of us sitting around this table, I'm not speaking out of turn, but the more and more I've thought about this over the last 5 to 10 years, the emphasis has got to be on looking after the youngsters. And I just feel empirically that if we can get young athletes, males and females, through to maturity, remember that your brain doesn't mature till you're 25, without significant head injuries, that brain has got to be more resilient and more likely to withstand anything as an adult. But if you've gone through 3, 4, 5 concussions from the age of 13 to 20, and you get a knock, whether you're playing for the old Rottinghamians third team or you're playing for the Saints, you're more likely to suffer.
Totally. And of course, the game at the school level and at the grassroots club level is being made safer because of the work that's done. There's more education, there's more awareness on this. There are companies like Luca trying to protect and police, but also people are starting to think about how to make the game itself safer.
Yeah.
And there is innovation that's happening.
Yeah.
Sam, you might want to touch on this, given that you know Glenn Harrison pretty well at St Paul's with the third game concept. It was trialled a while ago at this point. But and also perhaps start to talk about the move away from this collision-based game to more of an evasive-based game. That we all grew up playing and loving, and a pleasure to move. That you've been, those guys. And,
it's happening at the moment.
And I think just for some people that might be listening who are coaches at schools or indeed at clubs and are trying to work out a way of keeping youngsters engaged. We've got Stan, we've got Gabriel, and we were chatting yesterday over lunch, and their fondest memories of their school days, like mine, are from being out on a rugby pitch with your mates and beating your rivals. And it would be a travesty if future generations are not given that opportunity because of some of the things we talked about at the start of the podcast, and parents being too fearful to let their kids give it a go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm exactly the same. My happiest memories, bar none, were from playing sport at school, and it's incredibly important part of growing up and giving kids an outlet and learning. Or I mean, we don't even need to go back over what I've seen. This I think two things have stood out to me as like, okay, that's interesting. I don't know if they're the answer, but they're really interesting. And one of them is, you touched on Glenn Harrison's work at St Paul's, the third game concept, which is basically an attempt to go, how do we depower schools rugby? How do we reduce some of the collisions? How do we take the jackal out, which I think will happen quite soon, by the way. I don't know when this podcast is coming out, but it might already have happened. But I'm anticipating under 16 level in schools and clubs beneath the age of 16, the jackal will disappear. And if I was asked at the British Association of Sports Law conference a couple of months ago, what's the one thing you do? If there was one thing, take the jackal out of rugby. And then the other group, so I think that work is really interesting that Glenn and St Paul's have done, and there's lots of other smart schools that are interested in it as well. Let's keep that conversation going. And then this other group, Le Plaisir de Mouvement, LPM, as it's called now, I think just from a kind of big picture conversation, it's basically modelled on Pierre Villepro's coaching methods. There's a camp going on right now in a place called Lubersac, and I'm going to say on the record now, I'm going to go back next year. I went over there last year. You're going to come with me next.
Say you invited me.
Bill, if you want to come, you're more than welcome. It'd be great fun to go there. So the principles are basically all around running at space, avoiding collisions, going forward, supporting the ball carrier, endlessly going forward. Toulouse, it's what Toulouse rugby is based upon. It's the Ajax mantra from the 70s. It's that ingrained in rugby in Toulouse. You go to the universities, go to all the clubs, the schools, they all follow this method. And Toulouse, guess what? They're also the best club side in the world. So it's not doesn't have to be one or the other. But
I think it is important that the sport, doesn't just try and follow the traditions it always has done.
Yeah.
And I just say the third game it's intriguing one. It's one that many of us have done in training over the years anyway. And I think we know that 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds are going to mature at different times.
Yeah.
And so in order to keep youngsters within the game and developing a love of the game, that ability to be able to come in and out of the contact side. I mean, some may not want to go in because they're late developers, but play the third game and then move on. And then equally, people may find that they want to go in the opposite direction, but still be part of it. I mean, you can certainly look, I think New Zealand have tried, and that is not so much on age group, but actually on physical size, to match people better. I think that's another fruitful way to go forward as well. So I think it's important that rugby is fluid and flexible in the way it retains interest.
And that's a critical bit. Sorry, just to say that it's about retaining players. It's like, how do we make sure that when they get to 13, 14, 15 and then onto university or after school, like they're still interested in playing. Yeah. And to me, rugby and sport we should protect the fun element of it for as long as possible. Yes, take it seriously, but we shouldn't be trying to professionalise kids at 15. I just don't see rugby as. I don't think rugby should be a vehicle for it. Rugby in schools should be about helping one or two kids become professional academy players, to the detriment of everyone else. Like it's about a big, broad educate. It's part of the broad curriculum. There's loads to learn about within the game of rugby, as there is to do cricket, football, tennis, whatever other sports. But it shouldn't be the be all and end all at the age of 14. It should be about fun, enlightened coaches who are educated to educate and look after their people rather than just go, well,
I completely agree. And I think we're all on the same page there. And actually, the only thing I'd say about this is that it's not going to be at the detriment of people that have professional aspirations or schools that want to do well. I think, if you're just getting in the gym and you're one-dimensional at the age of 15, you're either going to get found out or you're going to get injured.
But it's
the odd one might make it, but actually, if we create all-round, well-rounded, holistic rugby players, we've got all the skills, all black, New Zealand S, everyone can catch, pass, step, and then you let people develop naturally in their own time without chucking supplements down their throats. I think that's a much more sustainable model. And maybe we start to think about, you don't need to be breaking into Premiership teams at 18. That can be, it can take its time.
Yeah.
And when you get there, you're ready.
And Bill would know more than, I mean, there's a lot of science and evidence to show that the best way to create rounded sportsmen is to play lots of different sports all the way through.
No, absolutely. Clara wrote about that 5 years ago. I mean, it does sadden me that, even my grandchildren at 7 or 8 showing aptitude at sport, already coaches want them channeled into one sport. And we know that 99.9% of these youngsters are never going to be elite people. And yet they've missed out on the opportunity to try so many other sports. And I feel very strongly that for every Olympic gold medalist we have in this country, there's 1,000 others who could have been Olympic gold medalists if they just found their sport, their coach. It is just pure happenstance. And we really need to encourage kids to, as you said, to experience all different types of sports. And there is cross-pollination, development of skills the transfer from one sport to another, as well as
and loads to learn from other sports as well. And I think, at the beginning you touched on that idea that rugby's become closed off to other sports. Like, there's so much to learn from other sports, just as there's so much to learn from other countries. Like, we should be open to new ideas, and that's, I think, what the boldest and bravest coaches are. They know
They need to try things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thinking of rough lunch here. Amazing. Well, as I said, I think we could go and go and go, but I think perhaps a good place to leave it. Is there anything else that you guys want to say today? You want to add?
Well, I mean, as I said, I would emphasise, I think there's a lot to be positive about, although it is understandable that rugby finds itself in a pretty difficult spot at the moment. There are so many good people in rugby. There's so many good people in sport. I just think we need to amplify their voices. And if we don't care about the players, then, people are just going to walk away. And as I think Bill's point about how bad a shop window professional rugby is for the game more broadly is true. I think we've got to recognise that schools and junior sport should not and cannot mirror the professional game.
Yeah. We just need blue sky thinking from those who are empowered to make the decisions on, as you said earlier, on the governance issues, to make sure that every facet of the game that we all love is truly cared for and properly resourced.
Tremendous. Thank you, guys. I've enjoyed that.
That was the Luca Health Podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, subscribe for more content like this. You can find us on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube.